The Ohio Chamber of Commerce proudly brings you another episode of Down to Business, a podcast that elevates the voices of business, community, and thought leaders, aiming to empower you and your business. That's why we're here, to aggressively champion free enterprise, economic competitiveness, and growth for the benefit of all Ohioans. Now, without further ado, it's time to get down to business.
Well, good morning. Welcome to Down to Business, the podcast where we dive deep into the heart of Ohio's business landscape. I'm Tony Long, and I'll be your host today for some strategies and stories and successes that shape our state's vibrant economy. Whether you're an entrepreneur, business leader, or someone curious about the dynamic world of business, you're in the right place. Today, we're going to talk with Chris Zeigler of API Ohio. Chris joined in 2013, and could you then maybe give a brief history of API Ohio?
Sure, happy to. First of all, thanks for having me today. I'm excited to be here. Appreciate the opportunity. So, I'm with the American Petroleum Institute, which in 2019, we celebrated 100 years being an association. We started back, the U.S. Chamber back in, 1917 started the National Petroleum War Service Committee.
Okay.
And that was a result of, this came on the heels of Standard Oil being broken up into individual companies. I think that after 1911, the U.S. Chamber started this to bring more domestic oil producers together to start ensuring that they had supplies for the war effort that was afoot in Europe. And the domestic oil and natural gas industry came together and petroleum industry came together, and they ensured that they had the fuel they needed for the war effort. But during that time, what they found was that a field in Findlay, Ohio, that's sending product to a refinery couldn't necessarily communicate with a producing field in another part of the state or the region. So as a result of that, the American Petroleum Institute was created as a standards-making organization to ensure that there was connectability between infrastructure and being able to send product to different markets. And actually on Sunday, it's the 100th anniversary of our first standard that we produced back in 1924,
Wow.
dealing with pipelines and oil country tubular goods. So we are the world's leading standards-making organization for the industry. So you could go to eastern Ohio and shale developing counties. You could go to other places in our country and find our stamp, our API stamp on pipeline material or a coupling. And it would be the same thing that you would see in Saudi Arabia or Africa or other parts of the world. So to date, we have over 800 standards that apply not only to equipment, but to processes, safety concerns. And you'll find those in the federal code, U.S. code. You'll find them here in Ohio statute. And we work well with regulatory agencies, both at the state and federal level, in terms of developing those types of standards for the industry.
That's great. Yeah, I don't know that people know that back end as well. It's a great lead into this. So before you were named executive director here in Ohio, you have a background in policy anyway, right? You were chief of staff for Congressman T-Berry, worked at the Cap Square under Speaker of the House, Joanne Davison.
I did.
So you've had background both in Washington and in Columbus. And with that background, can you speak a little bit about how energy's on the ballot this fall?
So, thank you for that. And that's actually what we say. Energy is on the ballot. Right. And we're seeing that now with candidates and talking points where people who were once against fracking or hydraulic fracturing are now for it. Folks who didn't necessarily support the industry previously are now saying we need the industry. Our suggestion is that we believe the industry and the products that we produce are a national asset. They provide not only energy security, but national security for the country, and it shouldn't be treated as a political football. And that candidates, whether the state, local, state, federal level, who talk about doing things or whatever, we want to make sure that the rhetoric meets the reality when they're actually in office and actually producing policy. Unfortunately, over the last several years with the Biden administration, we've just continued to see every attempt to stop or inhibit production of our natural gas and oil resources here in the U.S., not only to the detriment of, we believe, our national security, but the security of energy security of others across the world, including our allies in Europe and Asia and other places. So we think this is important. We think that people There are a number of issues on the ballot in terms of candidates addressing issues. We have economic issues. We have inflation, which is a big issue, the social issues that people are concerned about. But we want to make sure that people are also aware and ask their candidates about energy policy, where they may stand on particular issues. Again, at the local, state, and federal level, they all have an impact. So we're 17 days out from the election.
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
Yeah, early voting started, October 8th? So people are voting now.
Yeah.
So we would just encourage people to educate themselves, get to know more about the candidates before they go and, put a check next to someone.
And to your point on the importance not only of the product, I was out at an oil pad this summer, and most of the casting for the drilling came from a Youngstown plant.
Yeah.
So this is a fully integrated sort of sector that is important, I think, for Ohio's economy, obviously, and to your point, for national security as well, as we have our own oil and energy independence.
Yeah, I think when most people think about the industry, they generally, this isn't being critical, I think most people, they go and put gasoline in their car, or they actually come in and turn on their lights, or they go and using their iPhone, or they put on a pair of yoga pants and are completely unaware that all of those products and processes are related to our industry. The products that we produce contribute to a majority of the products that are on the market today, whether they be clothing or the plastics that we use in our furniture or cell phones. Actually, we did an event a number of years ago with the Cleveland Clinic and had a doctor talk about how one of the valves that he uses for open heart surgery is derived from a petroleum-based product. People aren't necessarily aware of that, not saying that they should be, but that's just hoping to give people a little bit more insight and awareness of what the industry actually brings to bear for our state, local, and national economies.
Yeah, I think Ohio is probably third in terms of chemical manufacturing. A lot of that comes from raw ingredients that come from the oil and gas industry, so it's quite important for Ohio. I also know API's now got a 5-point policy roadmap that I think folks can go out to the website and look at if you want to kind of give some highlights to that.
Yeah, so this is part of our Lights On Energy campaign that we began earlier this year. And Lights On, not necessarily the direct, more of our electricity is being powered by natural gas than other resources now, but just a lights on in terms of an awareness about the issues that are impacting Americans every day. So we released a 5-point policy roadmap that's been shared with state, federal, local policymakers to ensure that they're aware of some of the issues that we think are important in order to maintain our energy security here. So items such as protecting consumer choice. We've seen at the federal level there have been regulatory policies being put forward that would actually mandate more electric vehicle use and would actually stop production of internal combustion engines here in the U.S. And that's for passenger cars, light-duty trucks, and now heavy-duty trucks as well. Restoring the role of American energy in our geopolitical position. So I know we're not on camera, but I did bring a slide with me that it's very helpful in actually explaining a lot. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, Russia is supplying a lot of the natural gas that the European countries use. They had a hold in terms of, and they were going to use natural gas as a weapon in terms of turning people's positions against Ukraine and bolstering their position during their invasion. So as a result of that, America stepped up and started increasing our LNG exports, our liquefied natural gas exports. That helped to ensure that there were supplies going into those areas of the world, namely the European countries that were relying on Russia gas. But during that time in 2022, we saw both the European and the Asian markets an erratic response to a supply disruption. And at the height of that, we saw that natural gas was costing the equivalent of $580 a barrel of oil.
Wow.
For reference, today, we're in the neighborhood of $70 a barrel of oil. But what it showed, so as those Asian and European markets were being erratic and hitting those historic highs in terms of cost, we were consistent in terms of the supply that we had here domestically. We would say that's what energy security looks like. That's what it looks like when you have the ability to produce, develop, refine your own natural energy resources and not be reliant on other nations for that energy security. And so when we're looking at policies like pushing for EV mandates,
Getting rid of gas stoves.
Getting rid of gas stoves, putting further restrictions on refining operations, power plants. We're only pushing the ability for other countries to step in and provide that energy for us. So before 2008, we were relying on importing our oil in order for refining here in the U.S., ensuring that we have ample petroleum supply. But after that, we had the shale revolution that's reshaped the world in terms of energy security and ensured that we are, in fact, energy secure versus where we were previously. In addition to that, the other points, again, leveraging our abundant natural resources, fixing our broken permitting system, and tax policy. We've got an issue coming up at the first of the year. It's being referred to as Tax-mageddon at the federal level, and there could be far-reaching implications if some of those policies aren't handled correctly. So those are the 5 points that we've delivered to policymakers. I will say, in terms of the permitting process, that we are seeing, we've been dealing with this for a number of years in terms of getting a permit to build a pipeline or whatever it may be, energy infrastructure. And it's taken years. And in fact, in the Appalachian region alone, which includes Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, we had 10 major natural gas and oil infrastructure projects that were either canceled, put on pause, on hold, that affected nearly 5 billion cubic feet a day of natural gas production. And the only reason that we've seen one of those pipelines go forward was due to Senator Joe Manchin requiring it as part of a negotiation that he had. So it took an act of Congress to actually move a project forward versus just going through the regular permitting system. So that's something that needs to be addressed to ensure that we can continue to, again, develop our resources here. The other issue that continues to be a hindrance to our future development is our leasing program, our federal leasing program. So the Biden administration, first time in nearly 40 years, we've had 0 offshore leases, which leasing federal lands for development for oil and natural gas accounts for about 20% of our U.S. domestic production. It's a big chunk of it.
That's a big number.
And usually the retort is, well, America is the world's #1 producer of oil and natural gas, which we are, and we are producing record amounts of oil and natural gas. Well, that's true, but that's based on leases and policies that were in place that allowed us to do this. We are talking about 10, 20, 30 beyond years that will be impacted if we are not allowed to develop the resources that we have. Right now, we're more reliant on private lands for our oil and natural gas resources, and if that isn't fixed, that could really put a stop to our development, our energy security, and our dominance globally.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people realize you can get the permitting fixed, but it's all part of a process of you've got to find the land, you have to get the lease in place, you then have to permit to get through the land to develop the pipeline, and then you have to get it to market. And then you also then have to do with the exploration. So it's, I think, an integrated process that any piece of that is stalled, and it's going to impact 5, 10, 15 years down the road.
Absolutely. I mean, in general, we're looking 7 to 10 years in terms of how long it takes to bring a project to market. Now, that's not to dismiss that, there is a deliberate process that needs to be followed to ensure the safety of the communities that those projects are going into, any sort of potential environmental impact that needs to be accounted for. It just has come to a point where we go through a permitting process only for a project to be canceled, paused indefinitely. And again, that's no way to ensure that we have the resources that we need. The leases that are still producing right now in the Gulf of Mexico, those are leases that came during the Reagan administration. Wow. So that's when we're talking about time frame, we're looking out decades in terms of the impact here. So the Biden administration will have long since been completed when these products will be needed and will be producing. So again, to ensure that we are the world's #1 supplier of energy, we need to make sure that we have the ability to do that. And it's all because of innovation. There wasn't any sort of government mandate or requirement that the government put on the industry to say you have to do this. We're only producing this because of the innovation of the industry. I mean, that will continue only if we have the ability to have smart policies in place. That's why when we're talking about energy is on the ballot, that's what that means. And going back to the candidates to ensure that they are have an awareness of these issues and the impacts that their policies will have on everyday Ohioans, everyday Americans, for now and into the future.
Yeah, and there's a multifaceted sort of environment that we're dealing with in the courts and at the regulatory bodies, whether it's the LNG stopping of building to use our natural gas in a way to fuel Europe during the Ukraine-Russia conflict, whether it's Line 5 and whether that can continue to move product, or it's what I call getting science ahead of where we are commercially in some of the power plant rules. Mm-hmm. that we're facing. So I think federally, there's a lot of areas where we have to continue to monitor and try to get our voices heard as businesses.
Absolutely. Yeah. Part of that permitting process is you can, again, go through that entire process. And at the end of it is when you begin the litigation phase. So then it begins regulation by litigation. And generally that doesn't bear well for the projects that are trying to be completed. And again, all to the detriment of U.S., Ohio businesses, consumers, to ensure that we have safe, clean, reliable energy now and again into decades. I mean, the UN came out with a report a couple months ago that they're expecting 2 billion more people to join the human race by 2050. So that's a significant increase as to where we are right now. We just surpassed the $8 billion mark in terms of how many people are in the world. And as a result of that, we need more energy for those people. There are still areas of the world that are reliant on wood-fired energy to heat their homes, cook their food. And the arrogance that some people have in terms of, no, we need to ensure that we're doing things this way, or you can only use this energy resource, comes at the detriment of those developing countries that can use our resources, our energy resources that we can produce here cleaner, more reliable than any other place in the world. It was interesting going back to the Biden administration. Day one, the Biden administration nixed the Keystone Pipeline, or KXL as we call it. That was going to have develop a shorter route between Alberta, Canada, the oil resources up there, and bringing it down to Gulf Coast refineries. And that was again another project that took years to get to that point. And on that day, it was done. There wasn't any more for that particular segment of the Keystone Pipeline. And it was hailed by groups that don't support or don't believe that oil and natural gas should be part of our energy mix. It was hailed as a win. We've stopped this and our world is going to be cleaner. Well, what they didn't understand or appreciate is that those resources are going to be developed regardless. And in fact, a pipeline was sent over to the west coast of Canada, and those products are sent over to Asian markets to be refined. We would argue less safe, less clean. We can do it better, smarter, cleaner here in the U.S. And we think it was a knee-jerk reaction to some voices that were pretty prominent in the Biden administration in the early days and have continued to be there. So again, policies matter, and it does have an impact on everyday Ohioans' lives. We just may not be aware of it all the time.
Well, right, because of everything that the hydrocarbons go into in terms of consumer goods. And to your point, because of the standards and that you've developed over 100 years now, I think we're in a better position, safety, refinement, those types of things, to do it cleaner and safer here than in other parts of the world. Well, moving from the federal government, we now know we face a growing demand for electricity that we didn't think we needed as 2020 maybe, and then all of a sudden data centers started to come about.
Yeah.
Coupled with machine learning and AI. And I think we're going to need thermal generation. So this goes back to permitting and getting some assets put here in Ohio. What could we do here in Ohio to kind of try to move that permitting forward at the state level?
Well, I think those discussions have already begun. Thankfully, we do have policymakers at the state level who have an appreciation for the reality of where we are. I mean, the issues that we're talking about are good things. As a result of COVID, I think we're reshoring or bringing back our manufacturing base that we lost over several decades to other parts of the globe. So bringing back, the Intel plant is a prime example of being able to produce those products, those chips here in the U.S. instead of being reliant on other countries for those products. Yeah, it's a good thing, but as a result of that, there's an increased load on electric production on our grid, ensuring that we have the transmission lines to get that power to where it needs to be. So yeah, everything that we've seen, natural gas is the best near-term option to ensure that we are able to operate those plants 24/7. And if they're more reliant on other intermittent resources, wind and solar, when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, you need something to meet that demand. And those processes, whether they be data centers or the new hospitals that we're building, they need to ensure that they have 24/7 reliable power. And all the data points to thermal generation, natural gas being that best near-term option. Now, with that being said, there's a lot of investment and research into other sources. You hear more about small reactors. That's fantastic. But until we get to that point where they're ready for prime time, ready for market, ready to be turned on. We can't just have things shut down. So again, we're fortunate, I believe, that we do have policymakers here in Ohio who are having those conversations now, whether it's within our own state or with PJM, our RTO here, in terms of ensuring that we have enough generation, enough transmission to ensure that we're meeting not only the low growth that we're projecting for the stuff that's being built now, but what's coming in the future.
And the other piece to this is I think there are parts of the state that still have pinch points or constraints on the infrastructure for getting this oil and gas to places that would like to develop economically. So that's another area we're probably going to have to work on next General Assembly.
Yeah, I think that depending on the type of project, the infrastructure project, you could have the Public Utilities Commission through the Power Siting Board be involved in that. I know that there are conversations with counties north of here in Columbus that are talking about ensuring that they have natural gas pipelines because they want those resources. They understand that they're reliable. Outside of that, we're working with federal regulators to ensure that if it's a cross-border pipeline or infrastructure project, that we have what's needed to ensure that those can move forward.
And then moving into the future, I think we're partnering with you on developing carbon capture.
Yes.
And getting that infrastructure in place. And why that's important right now, the federal government has primacy on the rules and regulations, but if we can develop a state process, then we can control kind of our own future in that. And so I think we're working on some legislation.
Yeah, so we are working on the regulations to ensure that this type of activity can be done safely, reliably. There was a policy put forward in terms of investing in hydrogen hubs across the country, and Appalachia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Ohio was selected. Our region was selected for one of those hubs, and it was known at the time that it was selected because of all of our natural gas resources that we have here in the region. And its ability, when you have natural gas combined with carbon capture and storage, you can produce blue hydrogen for transportation purposes, for power generation, for other applications. But before they can move forward, we need to have the ability to capture the carbon and sequester it in geologic formations throughout Ohio. So we are working now with the Ohio Chamber of Commerce to ensure that we have the necessary regulations, again, that we can do this safely, not only for the communities that we're operating in, but for the environment. That's in the works, and we appreciate the legislators who are helping us with that. But yeah, more to come. That's part of that innovation. I think that when given a challenge, that industries, and not only the oil and natural gas industries, they can figure it out if given that opportunity to do something in a safe, reliable way versus being mandated by some sort of government entity that you have to do this.
Right.
It usually doesn't work out very well.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. Do you have any closing thoughts?
No, again, I appreciate the opportunity. I would just encourage, again, we're, I think, 17 days out from the election, would encourage, at least today, so today is Friday, would encourage voters, listeners to take the time to better understand where candidates may be on particular policy issues. You can go to, in terms of our 5-point plan that we discussed, you can go to api.org to find information about that, and there's other resources with regard to the industry. And then in terms of getting information about who your representative is, some of the issues that we're aware of for some of these candidates, you can go to energycitizens.org, and you can find out information about where your voting location is, where your polling location is, who the candidates are, and do a little bit more research before you go and press the button.
Okay, well, I want to thank Chris Zeigler, Executive Director of API Ohio, for sitting down with us today. That wraps up another insightful episode of Down to Business. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to subscribe for captivating conversations with key players and influencers in Ohio's business scene. Again, as Chris mentioned, feel free to go to api.org, learn about all the energy going on in Ohio, and get involved before the election wraps up. Thanks again, Chris.
Thank you, Tony.